Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we're going to work on creating a piece of digital art inspired by John Whitney. We'll dive into his history and background a little bit later on in the video, but he was, in short, a pioneer of early analog and digital computer-based artwork. We're going to be looking or kind of recreating art in the style of his Matrix series of artworks, which are from the early 70s and were generated on an early IBM computer. So they have this kind of early digital art quality to them. We've got some kind of overlapping shapes, which are going to be animating and moving around screen and stylizing a little bit. We're also going to be adding in a nice freeze frame effect, which you can trigger with the keyboard, again, inspired by John Whitney's work. So just to give you a little bit of background about John Whitney, he's kind of an interesting entry in this world of early computer art pioneers in that he's not a computer scientist or coder or a mathematician or anything like that. He actually started off making experimental films along with his brother James Whitney, and then kind of shifted from art, shifted kind of back and forth between art and commercial in the 50s and 60s. And you may be familiar with his work without even knowing it, because he helped Saul Bass create the famous title sequence for the Alfred Hitchcock film Vertigo, and then worked on a number of commercial projects after that. But his kind of entry into the world of analog and digital computing happens around the same time in the 1950s, where he takes what is actually like an anti-aircraft tool or weapon that was developed for the Army in World War II and converts it and modifies it to be able to instead work a camera and manipulate a series of plates and positioning the camera. And it's a very sort of complex mechanical device that can do all sorts of different movements and thus can lead to very interesting sort of animation possibilities that weren't really, feasible with the normal traditional camera setup. So he has these kind of like two phases of his career where he's working with this analog computer up through the kind of mid 60s, and he gets really famous for this work that he's created, does a lot of commercial work with it. And this video here that I've got pulled up called Catalog is a literal catalog of the kind of effects that were possible with that analog system. So it's got this very organic kind of quality to it. But again, remember, he's not like a mathematician or coding any of this information. It's all mechanical analog stuff that he's experimented with and created this very complex mechanical system to be able to generate. So there's some really cool, interesting stuff. He's dealing with like slit scan and a variety of other effects. But what's interesting is at the core of all this, there needs to be some kind of like hand-drawn or rendered like physical object, which he then starts with and then is kind of run in this mechanical system to generate this. So it's not really, digital at all. It's like it's a very hands-on approach to animation. So a lot of people really love this early stuff because it just has this sort of effect that you can't really replicate with anything else. But after he kind of got well known for this stuff, he was given a artist in residency at IBM in the mid 60s, and that is his kind of entry into the world of digital computing. And thus his films after that point kind of focus on working with the computer in those early days to generate artworks. So the piece that we're going to be focusing on replicating the aesthetic of is called Matrix. There's actually a series of Matrix films. These are from the early 70s. And again, these are generated with an early IBM computer. And if you actually watch this online, you can see that they have some credits, I think, somewhere in here that talk about it being filmed at IBM. That might be one of the other versions. But again, you can see that we've got the similar sort of aesthetic to what we had at the beginning with these kind of moving square shapes on the screen. They've got a sort of shadow effect to some of these ones in the background, which gives it this nice dimensional look. Multiple colors going on at the same time. And we're not trying to recreate the sort of compositional elements exactly. We're just using this as kind of like a starting point for inspiration. So the way that I'm looking at this is that we're taking this kind of idea of all these rotating surfaces of his analog work, which is again kind of mirrored in the way that these shapes are rotating and moving around screen. And then we're taking this aesthetic inspiration from Matrix, and we're going to combine those two things and generate a cool early computer graphic inspired piece of our own within Touch. One other thing that I wanted to point out before we continue is that the freeze frame effect is again inspired from this Matrix video a little bit later on. We can see here that there's these kind of flashes of these individual frames which are kind of frozen on screen for a moment before the animation continues on. So that's kind of where we're taking our inspiration from for that freeze frame effect. Okay, so let's jump into putting this together. We are going to approach this via 3D geometry. As you probably saw in the Matrix video, there are sort of different sections that include 2D geometry and 3D geometry. By making this with 3D geometry, we have the ability to kind of choose by rotating our shapes whether or not we are going to be displaying 2D or 3D. So I'm just going to give us that flexibility by making that choice instead of, say, approaching this with top textures alone. So we're going to grab a box SOP to begin, and we don't actually need to do anything to that operator. I'm just going to add a null after that in case you want to play around with any additional operators or swap that out for something else in the future. We'll then connect that to a geo and put that to the right, and then we're going to add ourselves a line material. We're going to use the line material to get a nice wireframe look, and we're not going to use the wireframe material because the line material has a couple of additional features which will help kind of make our final outcome look a little bit nicer as we're scaling it. So let's go ahead and apply that to our geometry. First of all, so I'm going to click and drag it onto Geo1, hit parameter material, and then we'll head back into the line material for a moment. So really the only thing that we need to do here is head to the line page in the parameter window and change the line joint type to miter. And that will just allow us, as we're scaling this shape up and down to create this animation, to have a nice sharp edge and not to, there'll be kind of these artifacts that'll appear with the wireframe when you're scaling to really small sizes that we can avoid with that option. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we can continue on with our rendering setup. So I'm going to go back to the comp page, grab a camera, place that to the right, and then we might as well just add the render before we modify the camera. So I'm going to grab the render, place that below the camera. The render top, we're going to try to mimic the 4:3 aspect ratio of those early John Whitney films, which may come from the fact that they were transferred to a laser disc, I believe, in the 80s, but kind of gives that vintage look nonetheless. So I'm just going to use a 1024 by 768 resolution for this situation. Then let's head back to our camera. We're going to make two adjustments on the the view page, actually, in that we're going to set our camera up to be an orthographic camera rather than a perspective camera, because we want to kind of have that same view. It's kind of an orthographic view that we see in the original Whitney piece as well. Perspective rendering would have probably been more complex, I'm guessing, at the time. So let's go ahead and change that projection from perspective to orthographic. We should then see our box change into, just our 2D flat box instead of that sort of pseudo 3D look that we saw a second ago. The other thing I want to do here is set my ortho width a little bit bigger. I'm going to set that to a value of 4, and that'll have the effect of kind of pulling us away from our box a little bit. Now that we have accomplished that, I'm going to add a null, and we can begin our kind of animation portion of this effect via setting up some LFOs. Now, as I mentioned, we're kind of taking inspiration from the fact that John Whitney's early analog stuff dealt a lot with these rotating motors, which would, provide these kind of oscillating visual effects, as well as the later, mathematical equations that were programmed into his digital artworks. And we're, again, channeling that inspiration via using the LFOs, which will give us that kind of oscillating motion. So I'm going to grab an LFO chop, and I'm actually going to grab 3 of them. So let's go ahead and copy and paste 3. So the first 2 are going to be used for translating in the X and Y direction, and the third one will be used for changing the scale of our box. So I'm going to start off by setting all of these to the same frequency of 0.125 to slow down that rate of oscillation, and then I'm going to modify them each individually. So the first one I'll just kind of leave at the default settings, and that'll be kind of our starting point. The second one, I will modify the phase slightly, so maybe something like 0.25 on the phase, and maybe even just to offset things a little bit so we don't have such even numbers, I'll do like 0.27 or something. I will then also decrease the frequency to something like 0.125 or 0.105 rather. And now those are kind of oscillating, a little bit off sync of one another, which is good. For our scale, I'm going to slow the frequency down to 0.06. I'll set the phase to something else, also maybe like 0.76 or something. Those are looking good. You can always come back and modify any of these to give yourself a modification to the final animation. Let's go ahead and then merge those together with a merge chop, and then I'll attach a null to the end, and that'll be where we can actually make some chop references from. So another benefit of going the route of 3D geometry is that we can apply these modifications or these translations and animations to our geocomp without too much of a performance hit. So we can do that again via chop references. So I'll take channel 1 and make a chop reference to the translate X parameter, which should immediately start moving our little box left and right. I'll take channel 2 and apply that to the translate Y parameter, make a chop reference there. And finally, for the scaling, I'm going to drag our channel 3 onto uniform scale, which will scale it uniformly in the X, Y, and Z directions and give us this nice animation where it almost appears to be like pulling away from the camera into infinity and then kind of coming closer. One other thing that I'm realizing I forgot to do here is actually set all 3 of these LFOs to the Gaussian type, which will kind of smooth out the animation transition a little bit more. So now that that is complete, we can actually get into creating our kind of stylizing of this effect. So obviously we have the kind of general path of motion that this will be taking, but the way that we're going to approach creating multiple of these boxes on screen is via the cache top. which will allow us to collect a number of frames and then selectively choose from that collection and composite all those things together so that we have effectively a bunch of different delayed versions of the same video feed. So I'm going to start off with the cache top right after our null, and I'm going to make one quick change here, which will be to set the cache size to 240. We're going to need quite a few frames here to give us the kind of spacing between the different instances almost of this geometry. Instancing is another way we could have approached this as well, but this will give us a kind of interesting look at using the cache top. So with that said, let's then grab a cache select top, which we're going to use to pull specific feeds from this cache top. So I'm going to first drag the cache top onto the cache top parameter, and you'll see we have started pulling video signal from the cache top. Then I'm going to use an expression to set this cache index value automatically so that we can then copy and paste a bunch of these and it will automatically kind of increment this index value. So what we're going to do here is type in an expression me.digits, which is going to grab the number after the or at the end of the title of this operator. And then we're going to multiply that by -20. So in this case, that will give us a value of -20 for our index because we have cache select 1 here. But if I then copy and paste it, you'll see the second one has a value of -40. So what this will in effect create is a sort of cascading effect once we have a number of these cache selects added to our network. So let's see how many I had here. Probably like 8 or 10 in the original. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Oh, I even had 12. So let's go ahead and copy this until we have 12. So that's 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And there we go, a huge stack of cache selects, which I'll then kind of line up a little bit better. Very good. Then if I composite all of those back together, including actually the cache top, which is just outputting the raw signal that it is receiving right now. So let's select all of those and drag them into our composite operator, and then flip this to an operation of over. We should see that we now have that really cool cascading effect where we have multiple delayed copies of that same piece of geometry, which looks really cool. So that is working and it looks great. Let's continue our sort of stylizing process. So in the original matrix, we have in a lot of cases, there are two different pieces of geometry that are basically following a similar or the same path and then have different colors applied to them. So we're just going to take the same video feed in this case and recolor it and then transform one slightly so that they again have this kind of mirrored effect. So I'm going to add a null after this comp just for good kind of housekeeping. And then what we're going to do here is use the constant top to recolor this video feed. So I'm going to actually use 2 of them so we can have 2 copies of this video signal. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that. So now we have 2 constants. In the first one, I'm going to grab this orange color right here with the color picker, and that looks pretty good. I might say bump the saturation up a little bit to something like 0.7. And yeah, that looks pretty good. So you'll notice that with the new version of TouchDesigner, by default, the the input will be composited with the constant color, which gives us a really fast way of recoloring our top textures. So that one looks good. In the second one here, I'm going to set the color to the yellow color right to the right of that orange that we selected last time. And here, I think I'm actually good with the default settings. We don't need to adjust anything there. So after that, I'm going to translate this yellow version slightly. So I'm going to use a transform top for that. And in the transform top, I'm just going to shift the X position negative 0.15. So that's going to shift it to the left slightly. And then I'm also going to shift it a little bit down by negative 0.07. Once we then composite those two top textures back together and change the operation to the correct mode of over, we should then see that we now have two of those same animations happening slightly offset from one another and in different colors. So that looks pretty cool. Another effect that the original had that we don't have right now is this kind of almost look like a shadow or an embossing kind of effect. And in that case, it was actually, there was even an additional set of geometry that was kind of moving around in the background that had that shadowy look, but we're actually just going to apply it directly to what we have on screen to give us a little bit more dimension. So the way that I'm going to approach that actually is very similar to what we've just done. I'm going to use the constant once again to recolor this video signal, which we'll do by changing the color here to black, which will change that to black. Then I'm going to add a transform to offset that texture very slightly. And that's just going to be a really subtle, small little 0.005 in the translate X and negative 0.003 in the Y, to just offset that from our color version of that texture. And then I might even add a blur at the end to just smooth that out a little bit and not make the shadowy version so sharp. And with the blur, we can just leave that at the default settings. So we'll go ahead and composite those two things together. And again, we're going to need to change our operation here to over. And we won't really be able to see it. I guess we can see it pretty well with the checkerboard background, but now you can see we have a nice offset shadow version underlaid of that animation. So that's looking pretty cool. The kind of final step here is going to be to add that freeze frame effect and then to apply a background in. So we can actually approach that freeze frame effect in a actually identical way to the way that we created this kind of cascading trailing effect, which is to use the cache top once again. So I'm going to add another cache top right to the right of our composite. In this case, we're not going to need a cache select because we're just using one instance of that texture. We're going to need to make a couple of changes to this operator, or at least one, which will be to turn the active switch off so that it is not constantly caching the input. Then I'm going to attach an HSV adjust so that the freeze frame version of this texture is a little bit different of a color from the original, but at the same time, we don't have to really dive too deep into the recoloring process. So I'm just going to set the hue offset here to 180, and then I'm going to set the saturation multiplier to 0.8 to kind of desaturate that a little bit. To enable us to only freeze frame when we've held down a key on our keyboard, I'm going to use a level top, which we'll use to fade in and out the opacity when that key is held down. And then I will grab a keyboard in chop to actually create that keyboard control. So after the keyboard in, I'll then add a filter to smooth out the on-off switching from that key. I'm then going to set the filter width to 0.2 so that the rise and fall of that channel are a little bit faster, and then I'll add a null to the end. So first things first, I'm going to attach this chop channel to the post page opacity parameter. So make a chop reference to that, and then you'll see we can fade in and out that cached image whenever we want. However, we are not updating that image prior to fading it in, so it's always going to be the same thing. So the way that we can approach updating the cached image is to make a chop reference from the keyboard in directly and make a reference to the pulse button next to the active switch. Then, whenever we hold down the 1 key, you can see that we will capture a new image from our feed, and then we'll be able to overlay that on top of our signal with a composite, which we'll add now. So let's go ahead and add that composite in, drag our second top texture into the second input of that composite, and then we can use over once again to give ourselves the ability to composite that in. So then if I hold down the 1 key, you can see that our composited signal is appearing in the background and gives us that freeze frame effect, which is super cool and fun to play with. So obviously you could take that further by actually, animating the fading in and out of that and the triggering of that cache top, kind of like it was in the original video. But I thought it'd be fun to just add a nice user controllable component to our effect. So the very final step here will be to add a constant top, again, to composite in a background. So for the background, we're going to use a nice blue color, kind of, again, accentuating the vintage look of this piece. For the red channel, I'm going to set that to 0.125. For the blue channel, or the green channel rather, I'm going to set that to 0.4. And for the blue channel, I'm going to set that to 0.5. That has the effect of recoloring our signal, which is not what we want. So we have to head to the output page where we're going to set the operation here to under. And that is our final John Whitney inspired animation effect, complete with a user controllable freeze frame. So obviously, this is a pretty straightforward one to put together, but that means that there is a ton of room for exploration. You can, of course, play around with the kind of effect portion, the post effects that we've applied here in a number of different ways. You can work with feedback as well as this caching technique. You can also play with instancing, although that can, have its own complexities to it. And of course, you can play around with the chops that we have used to generate the animation in the first place. You could even dive into something like the animation comp and get much more granular and specific with where things are positioned and the scaling and that sort of thing. Kind of in a similar way to what John Whitney would have had to do when programming the original Matrix series of animations. So hopefully this has been an inspiring and quick art piece for you to put together. Again, giving you an opportunity to take a look at the interesting early artworks of the past and seeing how we can take that as a sort of visual inspiration for playing around with the tools that we have now. So with that, we will close out the video. Hope you've enjoyed putting this one together. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one here on the Interactive and Immersive HQ.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.